So this is a topic that I have brought up very few times throughout Storytime. I briefly touched on it in Storytime 32, but that was literally my least viewed Storytime ever. I also referenced it last Storytime and said that I wanted to make a Storytime on it one day. So I figured out today, I'll talk about my experience being on the autism spectrum and how it has impacted my life and why I act the way I am. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 50 on March 24th, 2023. Now, before I get started, I want to go ahead and let you know that this Storytime will be a lot different from other Storytimes. Rather than telling y'all a story chronologically like I usually do, this Storytime is going to be a lot more research heavy. Basically, I've been doing lots of research on my condition and I've learned a ton about myself, so I figured that I would make this Storytime more like a presentation of facts, but these facts will be backed up by my experiences and situations I've been in that kind of allows me to confirm this information. As a result, this Storytime is going to be more professional than my others, although there will be times where it's more silly like my other Storytimes. I also even created a reference list that includes each source that I use cited in APA format. You can access it in the link in the description if you'd like to see where I got my information. Alright, so now that's over with, let's talk about my condition. So, I'm on the autism spectrum. The American Psychological Association defines autism as a group of disorders with an onset typically occurred during the preschool years characterized by difficulties with social communication and social interaction, as well as restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities. In other words, I was born with a condition that caused me to act really awkwardly in social situations, as well as have specific interests. Autism in all of its forms is classified as a mental disability, and according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 44 children are diagnosed with autism, although the ratio of people with autism are actually higher because this statistic only takes into account people diagnosed as a child and not diagnosed as an adult or not diagnosed. Now, autism is an incredibly broad disability, as there are so many different forms of it, ranging from forms that allow some to continue living normal lives, while pretty much making independent living impossible for others. That's why I refer to autism as a spectrum, since there are so many different types of it that all have different effects. Now, the spectrum is split into two sections, high functioning and low functioning. I am on the high functioning side. This means I can pretty much do everything by myself, but I still need some support emotionally and socially. Additionally, I also have difficulties with nonverbal communications, such as eye contact, posture, and trembling. Low-functioning autism would be those who pretty much have to have someone take care of them for the rest of their lives, as their condition prohibits them from really being able to function normally. In order to simplify this, psychologists created a level system to describe autism. There are 3 levels ranging from 1 to 3, with 1 being high-functioning while 3 being low-functioning, or 1 and 2 are high-functioning. Level 1 is your most mild and least severe form of autism. People who are level 1 usually have difficulties making friends and managing relationships, have very specific interests, have routine structures, and usually like to do things their own way. Level 2s are still classified as high functioning, but they usually struggle a lot more than level 1s, as not only do they have the same difficulties as level 1s, but they also have difficulties with non-verbal forms of communication and difficulty transitioning from one activity to another. I am a very high-end level 2, almost level 1, but a little more severe than level 1, and in level 3s are your low-functioning ones. Now, levels 1 and 2 are collectively often combined into a term called Asperger's syndrome. You'll hear me intertwine this word a lot with autism. It used to be its own thing, but now it's pretty much the same thing as high-functioning autism, so just keep that in mind whenever I reference it. I'll also be referring to quote-unquote normal people as neurotypicals, as I feel that using the word normal would be a little bit derogatory. So that's what autism is. Let's transition back to more of a Storytime-like discussion and talk about how I acted as a kid and what led my parents to believe that I was autistic and eventually got me tested. So, for starters, I was an incredibly weird kid. There were times when I would have infinite energy, but then there would be times where I would have no energy whatsoever. I'm still the same way now as an adult, although I really only have infinite energy whenever something exciting happens. Anyways, my life as a child was pretty much dominated by being by myself. While I did have a few friends, I still spent the vast majority of my time alone either playing with trains, blocks, or video games, as well as watching little kids shows like The Wiggles and Sesame Street, which, by the way, I got a really embarrassing story I know y'all are gonna enjoy later. But anyways, yeah, I spent a lot of my childhood alone. Now, this concerned my parents a lot. While it could have been just simple, extreme introverted tendencies, I did not speak my first word until I was 3 years old. Most people speak their first word between 10 to 14 months old, so I was way behind. As a result, I did not make my first true friend until the summer before my 4th grade school year. Yeah, it took me 9 years to make a friend. Once again, my social skills have always been horrible, so that should explain things. Now, there were also a ton of other factors, as well as from even when I was a baby. Because of these, my parents decided to enroll me in preschool a year early in order to try to get me the help with social growth and all that, which, honestly, I don't think it really helped much. Even though I had a really good preschool teacher and got along with others, I didn't make any friends and was still a weird kid. One thing in particular that made me super weird during this time was obsession over my interest. So as mentioned, I have a really embarrassing story regarding Sesame Street. So, I was obsessed over this show. Even though I think everyone as a toddler obsessed over Sesame Street, I took it to the next level. And by next level, whenever someone asked me what my name was, I would say that my name was fucking Elmo. Yeah, I wanted to be Elmo. Just to put this into comparison, my favorite anime is K-On! My favorite character from the show is Mio. So this would be like me saying that my name is Mio, as well as acting and doing the things she does. Yeah, that is not a very healthy obsession. Therefore, whenever I did this, my parents would usually cringe, telling whoever asked me that question that my name is actually Zach and I just had an obsession for Elmo. Eventually, I grew out of it as I got older, but my parents still make fun of me for it 15 years later. Staying on the topic of embarrassing moments about me, let's talk about another moment that I think made my parents officially recognize that, yeah, I might be on the spectrum. So in April of 2008, my preschool was doing a show where all of us would get on a stage and sing in front of our families. We basically sang some kids songs ranging from nursery rhymes to stuff made for this event. One particular song, which is also the only song from the show that I remember, was a song about fast food companies. The only lyric I remember it was McDonald's, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Pizza Hut. So although its lyrics were shit, it was still a fit for toddlers to sing, so we sang the song. Now, during the song, I was at a moment of infinite energy. Basically, before our show, my teacher pulled me to the side and told me to pretend that I was only singing in front of her, as I had really bad stage fright as a kid. So that's what I did, and it worked maybe a little too well. I sang this song at incredibly high notes with so much confidence that I pretty much became the star of the show. However, the shit hit the fan when I began to ignore what my teacher told me and looked at the crowd. This terrified the hell out of me, and I began screaming and crying. I immediately ran over towards my mom, who was in the crowd, and hid under her seat. Thankfully, I didn't have to go back on stage, so mom put me on her lap and we watched the others. So, this is the event that my parents started to realize that I was definitely not a normal kid. And it only became more evident as I went through elementary school. Eventually, my parents decided that it was time to see if I was ultimately autistic in September of 2012. So we got me tested, the psychologist ultimately decided that I was different, and they officially diagnosed me with high-functioning autism. So that's how I was diagnosed. Now, from this point forward, I would begin receiving special resources from the school. As an example, I went to a speech teacher throughout elementary school. I would also have social and cognitive therapy at school all the way until the first quarter of 7th grade. I would also get special accommodations on standardized tests, such as taking my test in a separate classroom and not having a bubble sheet. Additionally, I usually play with a fidget toy in class and during award ceremonies. In fact, I actually play with a fidget toy while recording story times, and I'm playing with one right now, although I'll touch on my life today near the end of the story time. But yeah, that's what accommodations were made for me. Now, even though I had these accommodations, this isn't to say that I became normal. In fact, I'll never be able to act normal, as there is no cure for autism. But it isn't to say that my life didn't become easier, as it did. In 4th grade, I would begin to make friends, and by the end of the grade, I was really popular. And in 5th grade, I was literally the most popular kid at school. In fact, I would argue that I acted a lot more like a level 1 or even a neurotypical in 5th grade. But unfortunately, all good things come to an end. And at the end of 5th grade, that happened. I was transferred to a different school district to be closer with my parents' work, so now I was back to square one and back to being a level 2 pretty much. That summer, Mom signed me up for a whole bunch of vacation Bible schools and a week-long church camp in order for me to meet others in my grade who were going to church, but they ended up being complete failures. Didn't make any friends at vacation Bible school, and I still have nightmares about camp. So see Storytime 41 or 49 from my experience with camp, by the way. So now let's talk about 6th grade, because wow was this a tough school year. I consider it the second hardest school year, only behind 8th grade, which I'll touch on later. Anyways, I was transferred to an intermediate school, so it only consisted of grades 5 and 6, so while everyone else knew each other in the school format, I was the only one who didn't. That's what made this school year so damn hard, but luckily, I still managed to make friends and was able to certify myself as part of the grade. So now let's jump to the summer of 2016, my summer before my 7th grade school year. So June 2016 might have been one of the most important months for me developmentally regarding my disability. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, on June 4th, my parents signed me up to start swimming at a local swim club. Like anything that involves socializing, I was not excited in the slightest, but my parents insisted I swim for at least a summer, so I did and had a blast. I ended up meeting my best friend here, and overall, I loved it. In fact, I loved it so much that I continued doing it all the way until March of 2019. If you want to hear more about my experience swimming, I'd recommend watching Storytime 19. But swimming wasn't the only thing that really impacted me this month. The other big thing was the start of my YouTube channel. Now, my YouTube channel has pretty much undergone so many changes in terms of the content and quality over its almost 7-year life. From 12 and 13-year-old me making Dimpman videos to 15, 16-year-old me live streaming to now 18-year-old me making story times, my channel has certainly came a long way. But what I really want to touch on is my speaking. Prior to starting my YouTube channel, I spoke incredibly shyly and barely made any noise when I spoke, with the exception of that one moment in preschool. But when making YouTube videos, these required me to speak up so my viewers could of course hear me. As a result, after each video, I continuously got better and better at speaking up to the point that I was then able to carry it to real life and speak up. As a result, I made a lot of friends in 7th grade and I had what I consider to be the best school year of my life, which is saying a ton since this is also my first year in middle school. However, if we skip over a year later, we'll reach by far the most difficult school year I've ever had, being 8th grade. So because of my academic success, the school decided they wanted to challenge me and have me take high school courses. Now, even though I've always been academically gifted, I've never been able to join academically gifted programs, as schools were not allowed to admit autistic or other mentally disabled kids into these programs for literally no reason. I don't know why, but at least this year, things changed, and I ended up being the first autistic kid at my middle school to partake in high school courses. So, how did these go? Well, I took 3 high school courses. I took World History during the fall 2017 semester, and like most history courses, it was stupidly easy. In fact, I even made the highest grade in the class. Then the spring 2018 semester, I took Earth Environmental Science. I'd say this course was far more annoying than hard, as the content wasn't nearly as difficult as doing the labs on my own and just getting the materials in general, since this was an online asynchronous course. But the class that really fucked me in the ass was Algebra 1, which was a year-long course. This is a hard class because not only did I skip 8th grade math, which is pre-algebra, but the content was difficult and we had a lot of homework. This put tons of stress on me, as on top of all this, my parents expected A's and high B's. If I made a low B, they would get really upset, and if I made a C or lower, that meant getting my phone taken away for an entire 3 months. They could care less if this was a high school course or that I was under a lot of pressure. They expected high grades from me. On top of all this, I was not getting along with my peers. I ended up sharing my classes with bullies, and as you might expect, I was bullied a lot during the school year. I don't really know exactly what caused my bullies to bully me, but I think much of it just had to do with my condition and therefore being vulnerable to bullying. Now, bullying is an issue everywhere, as 20% of students report being bullied. But amongst autistic students, 66% of us are bullied, and those with Asperger's make up the majority of that 66%. So unfortunately, I'm not the only one. Ultimately though, this bullying and stress would go on to give me depression and anxiety, and unfortunately, this only got worse and worse until in February 2018, I became suicidal and began harming myself. Then in March, I tried to kill myself. Thankfully, I got the help I needed, and ultimately was cured of depression. However, I never managed to get over the anxiety part, as I still have anxiety today. Now, although my condition greatly affected me through my elementary, intermediate, and middle school years, it actually barely affected me throughout my high school years. I think the main reason was because I went to a special high school called an early college. This is a high school where students graduate with both a high school diploma and an associate's degree when they graduate. Students actually have to apply to go here, which only around 25% of whom get accepted. So the people I went to school with were people who actually cared about their education and weren't in school because the government forced them to. So none of the troublemaker shit went on here. As a result, I got along super well with my peers and pretty much was in a similar position as I was throughout 4th and 5th grade, since all of us were equally popular since we were all friends with one another. However, my disability would become relevant again when I started college. So I ended up being so successful in high school that I managed to graduate a semester early with a high school diploma, associate's degree, and a business administration certificate, making me the first person and so far the only person to ever do so at my school. As a result, I got to begin my junior year of college at only 17 years old in January 2022. I am pursuing a degree in accounting and a minor in economics. I was originally double majoring with finance being my other major, but I chose to drop the finance degree since it wouldn't fit with scheduling and I realized I wouldn't be able to satisfy my CPA education requirements if I did it instead of taking Principles of Accounting 2, so I'm taking that class instead. Anyways, the spring 2022 semester was an incredibly rough semester for me. From taking actual university classes for the first time to sharing a room with a drug dealer to being on my own for the first time, I was in a new world. But I'd say what made this semester far more difficult was fitting in. It was already hard enough to fit in due to my age. My college has a completely bullshit rule that requires students to be at least 18 to join clubs. As a result, I couldn't make friends that way, and of course with my condition and all, going up to someone and striking a conversation was almost impossible. In fact, I've never even made a friend before. It's always been someone who made a friend with me. But ultimately, I still managed and came out successful. It was still super difficult and so far the hardest semester I've had, but I pulled through and made good grades, went to a Bible study and met people there, and yeah, pretty good. The fall 2022 semester was certainly much easier as a result. I ended up getting a 2-bedroom suite to myself, which was literally the best feeling in the world. I also made good grades and even went on my first date, although she rejected me when I asked her out again. And now I'm in my third semester. Now in my third semester of college, it's been a super weird one. Although it's been a really good semester, I've pretty much became a lot different than I was in my first and second semesters. For example, instead of being more extroverted like most people do in college, I became even more introverted. Like the only times I even go out now are to go to class, work, and eat. I pretty much just coop up in my room. It doesn't bother me one bit. I love isolating myself from everyone. It feels nice to have peace and be able to do whatever I want. Once again, I don't know why, but I've pretty much gotten more and more introverted this semester, and I love it. My super extroverted parents absolutely hate it, claiming I'm not going out and I am wasting my life, but I don't see myself wasting my life, as this is kind of how I love to live. But that isn't to say I'm not doing any socialization. I recently became a tutor. I tutor accounting, statistics, and calculus. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love my job, but usually by the end of the day, I'm completely socially drained and I have to retreat to my room. If I'm socially drained, I count that as socializing a ton. So yes, I am still socializing a lot, just in a professional setting and I'm getting paid for it. So yeah, that's how my condition has developed over the years. For the next part of the story time, I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of being autistic, as I think these are pretty cool and sometimes mind-blow me that these only apply to us and not everyone. So to start, let's talk about disadvantages. Probably the most obvious disadvantage that I and other autistic people face is lacking innate verbal and nonverbal social skills. Now, although doing research on autism is pretty easy to do, doing research on neurotypical people is really difficult to do since they're the majority. But from what I've gathered, it seems like neurotypicals find socializing soothing, as they can talk at a normal pace, they can read facial expressions, and they can read facial expressions. Meanwhile, I get very anxious with socializing, as I have a difficult time managing my talking speed, and I can't read facial expressions whatsoever. But even more obvious than verbal skills that autistic people lack are nonverbal skills. It seems like nonverbal social skills neurotypical people have include eye contact, hugging, social smiling, and orienting to name. These are all things I struggle immensely with. In regards to eye contact, I almost never make eye contact, as it usually makes me very uncomfortable. As for hugging, while I've gotten over it as I got older, as a kid, I always thought of it as a restraint of movement and therefore hated hugs. For social smiling, I don't really smile much, and for orienting to name, this is referring to recognizing a person and their name. I have a very hard time recognizing someone, even if it's my own family. So these are just some verbal and nonverbal social cues that me and other autistic people struggle with. Another disadvantage that autistic people will face is limited interest. So you'll come to know that I have very limited interest, but I have deep interest in them. For example, I've always been good at math. That's why I'm studying accounting and economics in college, since both of these subjects use a lot of math. As a result, my math grades, with the exception of Algebra 1, were always higher than my English grades. Speaking of which, according to a 2013 Stanford University study, autistic people are usually way better at math and reading, since math is usually concrete while English is theoretical. I'll explain this more in detail when we get to the advantages side, but the reason this is a disadvantage is because of our limited interest. We have a more difficult time talking about different things with people, and as a result, this makes socializing even harder for us. Take me and my family as an example. I have very little in common with my family. While they are loud, extroverted, big sports fans, and very religious, I am quiet, introverted, not a sports fan, and although I am religious, I am not nearly as religious as them. As a result, when I talk about sports, I can't really say much or connect with them because I don't care for sports. Now, if we were talking about metal music or video games, I can connect much better and be more engaged in the conversation, since I love both of these. A third disadvantage that we have is that we are not understood by most people. Neurotypicals tend to have an incredibly difficult time understanding autistic people and why we act the way we do and all. This makes sense, since we're different from other people, and as a result, we're seen as weird and sometimes even socially stupid. I see this a lot with my mom. The only thing me and my mom have in common is blood. Other than that, we are completely different. I'm a shy, introverted, autistic man, while she's a super confident, extroverted, and neurotypical woman. As a result, we see things in completely different lenses, and we don't really understand each other. In fact, this isn't just an autism thing. It can also be something to bring up when talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. So this is really more of a diversity and inclusion issue as a whole rather than a specific autism issue. That's why I don't support a cure for autism, as I don't think we need a cure for autism. We just need to be accepted. For a fourth disadvantage, autistic people are more prone to suffer with mental health disorders. This ties in with the previous disadvantage because we aren't understood or have anyone really to back us up. We tend to feel bad about ourselves and have low self-esteem. As a result of not meeting our psychological needs, we tend to develop mental health problems more easily, such as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and addictions. In fact, according to a British study, 7 out of 10 autistic people have mental illnesses, while only 2 out of 10 neurotypicals do. I also want to touch on anxiety in particular, since I have diagnosed anxiety and have had it for almost 6 years. One of the main reasons why autistic people are more anxious than neurotypicals is because we often have quote-unquote blend in. In other words, we have to act like neurotypicals, which is incredibly stressful to do because we have to try to figure out how to act and not make it seem like we're acting, which is not fun to do at all. I've noticed this a lot during interviews. Oftentimes, I find myself frustrated with interviewing because I have to put on a persona because I'm in an environment that is very heavily against me. This might also explain why between a whopping 50 to 75% of adults with autism are unemployed, since oftentimes it feels like interviews were made to weed out autistic candidates. As a result, because we have to act differently when we're out, we have more stress levied upon us and therefore we develop anxiety. This also explains why we don't sleep as much, which I'll get to in a bit. Now, these disadvantages can all be correlated to the fifth disadvantage I want to talk about, which I will warn you, is a little disturbing, and that's the fact that we have lower life expectancies than neurotypicals by around 16 years. Currently, the life expectancy in the United States is 77 years, so this means that autistic people have a life expectancy of only 61 years. Yeah, that's very concerning. But there's a statistic that concerns me even more than that. Amongst neurotypicals, not sure why I said autistic there, the leading cause amongst neurotypicals is heart disease. But for autistic people, the leading cause of death is actually suicide. If you take what I talked about for the third disadvantage, as well as the fourth, you can see why we're more prone to suicide, since we're more likely to develop depression. In fact, autistic people are over 7 times more likely to die by suicide than neurotypicals. Unfortunately, I can completely see why, as nobody gives a shit about us. They think we're useless just because we're challenged and they think we're useless to society, so they bully and harass us and force us to mask up who we really are. Then we feel worthless and then we fucking kill ourselves. And I'm not exaggerating this at all. I was only 13 years old when I tried to kill myself. It's a terrible world we live in. I wish we could just be understood and not have to pretend to be normal, but unfortunately, I don't see this happening anytime soon. But it isn't to say that suicide is why all of us die, as many of us die from stress and anxiety. As mentioned, having to put a fake persona on us makes us feel bad about ourselves and stresses us out. Chronic stress can decrease life expectancy, so that also explains why we have lower life expectancies than neurotypicals. But enough of that, let's talk about a sixth disadvantage, and that's sleep. So from my experience, I have a terrible time falling asleep. Like, usually, I do not go to bed until around 3 AM, although most of the time it's past that. And that's even if I get like 20 hours without sleep. This isn't anything new, as I've always had difficulties with falling asleep. That's why I've always hated bedtime set by my parents, because I could never fall asleep at that time. Like in elementary school, my bedtime was 9 o'clock, but I usually did not fall asleep until 11. But the great thing about science is that it attempts to prove this, and it does in this case. Studies have shown that autistic people are more likely to have genetic mutations that control sleep, as well as more likely to have insomnia. On top of that, one big side effect of anxiety is lack of sleep, so I think this explains pretty well why autistic people struggle with sleeping. This in turn also explains why we tend to be night people, which I'll discuss more on the advantages side, since being a night person actually has some benefits, just like being a morning person does. A seventh disadvantage is that we are very sensitive to loud noises. So you'll come to know that I do not like July 4th all that much. Now, before any of you die-hard exotic Joe worshipping rednecks from backwoods Alabama tell me to move, let me be clear. I love America, but the reason I don't like her birthday is because of fireworks. I absolutely hate the sound of gunpowder, which I find a little strange since I'm also a big supporter of gun rights. But really, I just hate the noise. I don't know, it just bothers me so much, and every July 4th, I usually wear these orange rubber earplugs to cancel out all the noise. A UCLA study looked into this, and it seems like this is because autistic people's brains have more activity going on when hearing noises, and as a result, we are more sensitive to noise than neurotypical people. Same goes with crowded places too. I always get super nervous around crowded areas, which I'll be honest, that might be the dumbest thing to get nervous about, but I do. I don't know why, but I tend to feel scared when in a crowded or loud environment. I guess a lot of this is just because I'm sensitive to loud noises and environments, but so that kind of explains my nervousness. But it's not just walking in loud areas that I want to discuss. I also want to talk about communicating in loud environments. A good example would be at work. So where I work, we have 5 tutoring rooms where tutors can do their sessions peacefully, but then we have 6 open common area. From the times that I've been tutoring, I've determined that I tend to be much more efficient in the quiet areas than loud areas. As a result, I usually tutor in the quiet rooms since I can focus on my students and not be distracted by my environment, since I'm really sensitive to the louder environment. Scientists call this hyperacusis, which tends to affect most people on the spectrum, as well as a lot of people not on the spectrum, particularly introverts. An 8th disadvantage of having autism would be listening and following directions. Now, although I've never been a troublemaker, a lot of autistic kids end up being troublemakers and are usually the ones getting sent to the principal's office every other day. Contrary to what a lot of teachers try to claim, this isn't necessarily because the student is horrible or a little demon, but rather because of a misunderstanding. We have a very strange way of processing information and following orders. It's pretty hard to explain because I don't know how it works for neurotypicals, but for us, you have to be very specific about your directions. This was something that my mom absolutely couldn't stand when she was teaching me how to drive. A prime example was when we were on our way to the beach and we were about to get on I-85. We were getting close to the exit I needed to take to get on it, but the problem was that she was shouting turn. The problem? I didn't know where to turn or if I was turning left or right. I asked her where, but she just got irritated and we had a whole argument over something trivial. Looking back on this 2 years later, it wasn't my fault whatsoever that I couldn't understand mom's directions. I'm just wired differently and need more specific details. You have to tell me to turn left at the next stoplight, not turn, because I don't understand vague instructions. This is actually why the US military does not enlist autistic people for combat roles, as we struggle with orders and would therefore be guaranteed to die in life or death situations. Personally, I don't mind this at all, as I don't want anything to do with military whatsoever. Therefore, if the US has another draft, I'm gonna sit back and relax. So, those are just a few of many disadvantages that we autistic people face. But unlike what the media, as well as how I've made it out to be so far in this video, autism is not completely bad. In fact, autism has a lot of really underappreciated pros that can sometimes actually outweigh the cons, although not all of them. For one, autistic people are really smart. Now, I get this is just a stereotype, but I feel that our society has become somewhat polarized that we think all stereotypes are bad when in reality, only some of them are, as stereotypes can also be good. Like, I don't know about you, but I automatically being deemed smart because I'm autistic pretty well. But unfortunately, this stereotype isn't all that accurate. The average IQ in the United States is 100. Meanwhile, between 43 to 59% of autistic people have an IQ at or above the average, implying that we're kind of the same as neurotypicals in regards to IQ distributions, as we also have a normal bell curve distribution of scores like them. But this isn't to say that we're average in terms of intelligence, as a fair amount of people, a fair amount of people who make up the top 2.5% of the population, aka people with an IQ over 130 or 2 standard deviations from 100, are autistic. I happen to fit in this category. Last year I did an official IQ test and it was determined that I have an IQ of 143, putting me in the top 0.21% of the population, or almost 3 standard deviations higher than that average. Although to be fair, I have a difficult time believing I'm that smart, since throughout my life, I've always believed that my IQ was 128. But this test was conducted by a scientist who knew his shit, so I can't really dispute that. But autistic people make up a higher proportion of the top 2.5% than neurotypicals, which is actually how the stereotype came to be. So, yeah, even though some of us aren't that smart, especially the ones on TikTok, the ones who are incredibly smart. Another advantage that autistic people have is that we can spot patterns very easily. In autistic people's brains, the temporal and occipital regions, which are associated with perception and pattern recognition, have a lot more activity compared to neurotypicals' brains. As a result, we tend to spot patterns and recognize relationships much easier than neurotypicals, which also explains our repetitive behaviors. It also explains subject interest too. As mentioned earlier, autistic people tend to like math and science more than reading, and as mentioned, my favorite subject is math. I love math because the answer is concrete and there's always a specific correct answer, although there can sometimes be more or no answers, but they're still not theoretical. As an example, 2 plus 2 is 4. There's no other answer or other technique that otherwise disproves this. It's always 4. But in English, the answer isn't concrete. It's almost entirely based on the teacher's interpretation. If you don't interpret the text like them, it's wrong. If you do, it's right. That's why I hate English and other theoretical subjects, as I hate questions with no absolute right answer. And it seems like my fellow autistic peers are in a similar boat as me. Because we're able to recognize patterns more easily, we're much better at math while neurotypical people are better at English. In fact, 16% of autistic college students choose to major in computer science, which is a pretty math-oriented and pattern-heavy major. It's also a very predominantly introverted field too. Meanwhile, the most common major for neurotypicals is business administration, which isn't a very math-heavy or pattern-heavy major, but is a very extroverted-heavy field, although that's mostly because of the frat rules. And by business administration, I mean general business, not specific fields like accounting or supply chain management or anything like that. It's also proven that autism is more likely to run in families of mathematicians and engineers. We can also connect this to my field too. Accounting is a really good field for autistic people, as we not only use math, but it's all about rules and regulations that we can identify patterns with and easily get down pat, since accounting is very rigid in structure. So in other words, autistic people do very well in STEM and other math-oriented majors and careers. Third advantage is what I mentioned earlier, being night people. As mentioned, I tend to stay up really late. While part of it's because of anxiety and insomnia, much of it is because I'm usually very most productive and have most of my energy at night. Take my senior project as an example. For it, I had to create a Google site explaining basically how far I've come throughout high school and what I've learned. I stayed up until 4 in the morning working on this thing, and I didn't even get tired from it as I was super focused and motivated to work on it at nighttime. I worked on it for a total of 6 hours straight. I would have not been able to do that had I chosen to work on it for the morning or afternoon. And, by the way, if you're interested, you can watch Storytime 45 to learn about this project, as well as my senior year of high school entirely. Now, a lot of this can also be linked to personality as well. Introverts have a tendency to be night owls, while extroverts tend to be morning birds. Considering the vast majority of autistic people are introverted, you can see from a personality standpoint why autistic people tend to be night owls. I can also prove this with my family. As mentioned, I am the only introvert in my family, and as expected, I am also the only night owl in my family, as my parents can barely stay up past 10 and my sister is usually asleep by midnight. A lot of this has to do with noise. At night, it's usually much more peaceful and not much noise, which is the type of environment I like. But in the morning and during the day, there's more noise, and as a result, that's why extroverts tend to be morning people. But unlike what a lot of influencers and other people try to claim, it's okay to be a night owl. I get morning people are usually more successful, but that doesn't mean that being a night owl is completely terrible. For one, night owls are usually much more intelligent than morning birds, and that correlates to intelligence regarding personalities, as although this study has a weak correlation coefficient, smarter people tend to be more introverted. Night owls also tend to have more mental stamina and are more creative, so being a night owl is actually a great thing for autistic people. A fourth advantage of being autistic kind of relates to being intelligent, but it's not necessarily being intelligent as it is learning fast. Autistic people, if it interests them, can learn something very quickly. As an example, many autistic people have hyperlexia, which is the ability to learn how to read and write really fast at a young age. I learned how to read and write when I was just 3 years old, while most kids don't learn how to do these things until they're around 6 years old. In fact, I learned how to take tests when I was in kindergarten, which was when I was 5. This is why I think people claim autistic people are smart, as we learn fast, but that doesn't correlate with intelligence. But it is a very unique and very useful skill. Fifth advantage is that we are some of the most honest people you will ever meet. I'm not exaggerating this at all, as I alongside other autistic people have such a difficult time lying. To be fair, this can be pretty bad in some situations, but in most cases, being honest is the best thing you could do. So if you hear an autistic person claim that they did or didn't do something, you can usually trust them, as it takes a ton of effort for us to lie, as we didn't have to back up that lie, which we aren't the best at. This happens because we have a difficult time interpreting other people's feelings and nonverbal expressions. As a result, we can be very brutally honest, so that's why we don't lie a lot. I've kind of gotten over this, as I can now lie whenever I kind of need know the truth would hurt someone, but in other situations, I usually tell the truth. Now, for the sixth advantage, my family makes fun of me all the time for this, and that's having an incredibly good memory. In fact, I don't even need to prove this one, as storytimes speak for themselves. Like, I literally wrote an almost 40,000 word storytime about my 8th grade school year, and I wrote it while I was a senior in high school. It's Storytime 40, by the way, in case you are interested in watching it. On top of that, I remember quite a bit from my early childhood, such as the embarrassing moments I had in preschool, taking practice spelling tests in kindergarten, taking actual tests in 1st grade, being diagnosed with autism in 3rd, and so much more stuff that happened back when I was a boy. And it seems like other autistic people I've spoken to also remember way back, so having a good memory is definitely something not many people can say they have. A seventh advantage is being able to concentrate for long periods of time. That is at the right place at the right time and when motivated. I'll again use Storytime 40 as an example of this. Even though it was incredibly long, it only took me 2 weeks to write it because I had 2 incredibly long sessions with it. One was a 10-hour session and the other was a 14-hour session. Both of these sessions started in the late afternoon and ended early in the morning. Additionally, my family was out of town and I was the only one home for the weekend, so that was the perfect time and place to do these sessions. And also, for those wondering, I did not sleep for the entire 108 hours my family was gone. I stayed up that long. Would not recommend doing that, but it sure was fun as I don't know what. So there are a lot of advantages to autism than just that, but that's all I got going to list out. For the next part of the story time, I want to talk about current and future challenges that will be facing me in regards to my disability. So, as mentioned, I'm in college. I'm currently in my 3rd semester and I have 2 more left until I graduate. As I said earlier, college has been particularly difficult for me because of my condition and trying to fit in. On top of me becoming even more introverted than I think I've ever been, college hasn't been the easiest, but I've gotten used to things and now I'd say college is pretty stable, and I certainly see myself easily able to graduate next spring. My job is also going really well. Even though it is socially draining and it's still a really fun job and has benefits me in so many ways. It's also good that I get the socialization here because if it wasn't for my job, I would probably not be socializing at all. I would be cooped up in my room and only go outside to go to class. And even though that sounds really fun to me, it's not good for me mentally. So it's good that I'm getting socializing time. I reserve my weekends to hide myself from the world. As for when I am tutoring someone, I usually play with a ball to help me with my speech. I also play one when recording story times too, since it helps me talk slower and clearer. I'm very well liked at the tutoring department and have very high reviews, so I'd say things are going great there. Now, the future is where things are going to be a little more stressful. So some accounting firms have already opened up their positions for summer 2024, which is when I'm looking at getting my first accounting job. Now, you'll come to know that I hate the job marketing process. I hate how it's so geared towards extroverts and neurotypicals, and it's all about networking and getting jobs through people you know. And then we wonder why more than half autistic people are unemployed, but fortunately I can't really do much about this. Maybe in a few years when I become a manager, I'll look more at a candidate's skills and experiences rather than how extroverted or how social they are. But I first gotta get a full-time job, and then it'll probably get a little easier from there. There's also the issue with relationships. Getting a girlfriend or boyfriend for autistic people is incredibly difficult. Only 9% of us ever get married, and only 32% of us even date someone. Considering I'm almost 19 and never dated anyone, honestly, I don't really have much hope of ever finding love. It sucks since I really want to raise a family one day, but I guess it is what it is. At least this isn't nearly as much of a problem as it was last year when I was searching for a relationship. Now that I'm not searching anymore and I feel much better about myself. So who knows? Maybe the single life is for me. If I do end up being single forever, at least that means I won't have to socialize much and I can do whatever I want. And unlike what society says, being single ain't all that bad. So maybe I could do that. And then there's also my current issue with anxiety. Pretty soon I might have to start taking medication, whether it be for anxiety itself, sleep medication, or both if I really need it. In January, I stopped going to the gym because of the whole TikTok trend where girls would falsely accuse men of staring at them, and knowing my college has a ton of those type of girls, I didn't feel very safe at the gym. But now that the trend has pretty much died out and those girls are getting the hate that they deserve, I might try going back. Although maybe instead of running on a treadmill for 30 minutes, I might try taking walks on a hiking trail my college has. Maybe go in the morning when nobody's around. No music, just peaceful walking. I think that would help a lot too, since it would put my mind at ease and allow me to relax. Something I don't really do all that much. Maybe a little while I'll go back to doing sprints. And I have no idea what just happened. Um, but yeah, that's wraps up the story time. Definitely not as long as story time usually is, but it was short, sweet, and informative. So maybe I'll do more of these research-based story times in the future, as I had an absolute blast writing this one. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you